glad that you're able to join us today. We have the great honor of having Dr. Ken Tao. Dr. Tao is a graduate of UC Berkeley in a Bachelor's of Science in Bioengineering and Bachelor of Arts in Molecular and Cell Biology. He was a member of the Phi Beta Kappa and Tau Beta Phi and the recipient of the Jeffrey Winter Memorial Prize, the award given to the top graduating senior in neurobiology who has an emphasis in molecular cell biology. Dr. Tao completed his PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University and the Harvard School of Medicine. Dr. Tao is nationally recognized as a premier MCAT mind. He has worked thousands of undergraduates and graduate teaching assistants and MCAT instructors and tutors, first starting with the Princeton Review and then also founding the MCAT program at MedSchool Coach. He has been one of the highest rated MCAT tutors while he worked for Princeton Review. He has written content for dozens of MCAT books and guides. Dr. Tao has a track record of improving student scores for the MCAT, and the scores have achieved above the 520 in the new exam and 40 in the old exam. And I also have an honor of having him join us because not only he's an expert in MCAT, but is somebody that I could call a friend. So thank you again, Dr. Tao, for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Ruben. So let's go ahead and jump in because I know there's usually a lot of questions, and if we can get through the slides faster, we can address more of the questions that you might have. This is the third of a four-part series that I'm giving for Pre-Med CC, and we're heading more and more towards the MCAT exam, right? So we started talking about how students can prepare for STEM courses. Then we talked about how to plan out your coursework as you're heading towards MCAT. And today we're going to talk about how you can start preparing for the MCAT as a community college or first or second year student. So Jubin gave a nice introduction for myself, so I'm not going to add too much, right? My name is Ken. I'm the director of MCAT for MedSchool Coach. I went to UC Berkeley for my undergrad, went to Harvard for my PhD in neuroscience. I've been helping students with MCAT for 12 years now, the first 5 years with the Princeton Review. In the past 7 years, I have led the MCAT division at MedSchool Coach. So here's the plan for today. We're going to talk about how to develop study skills as a community college or first/second year student. And then we're going to talk about strategies for preparing for each section of the exam. And I'm going to try to provide as many tips as possible for early studying, right? And then, of course, we'll have Q&A in the end. So any questions you might have, I will be happy to address them. All right. So anytime I'm speaking to a student who is a freshman or someone who's not going to be taking the MCAT for multiple years, I honestly tell them you shouldn't be studying for the MCAT yet, right? It's too early. You should actually be focusing on your college courses. And the reason why I say this is because the MCAT exam is a very difficult exam, but it's not one that you should be spending multiple years preparing for. You should really only be spending 4 to 6 months preparing for the exam. That's the case for most students, right? Now, there are some students where it makes sense to start early because their starting score is very low and their target score is very high. So in those cases, the student might need to study longer for the exam. But even in those situations, the longest that I would recommend a student to start studying for the MCAT is 1 year in advance of their test date, right? So if you think about it, let's say you want to take the MCAT in the spring of your junior year. That means the earliest you should consider starting your MCAT prep would be the spring of your sophomore year. And many students would actually wait until that summer or the fall of your junior year, right? So of course, today we're talking about if you're a community college student, if you're a first or second year undergraduate student, well, chances are you are more than a year away from your test date, right? So my response is the same to you as to all the other students who are just too far away from the MCAT, which is at this point, don't worry about the MCAT, just focus on doing well in your college courses, right? And here I have on the slide a list of all the prerequisite courses for MCAT, right? Gen Chem, OChem, physics, biology, biochem, psychology, and sociology. And keep in mind for most of these classes, you also need the lab component, right? General chemistry with lab, organic chemistry with lab, biology and physics with lab and such, right? And if you can't take all of these courses before you take the MCAT, it's okay, right? If you're missing psychology or sociology, it's not that big of a deal. Those subjects are pretty easy to self-study. If you're missing a semester of physics, that's okay too, right? It only becomes an issue if you're missing multiple classes before you take the MCAT, right? You can't take the MCAT if you haven't taken biochemistry, physics 2, and Orgo 2, right? That's a little too much. So why do I recommend students who are early to focus on their classes? Well, again, it's just because the MCAT is not something you study for multiple years. And in a sense, studying and doing well in your college courses is the same thing as preparing for the MCAT. And the reason why is because number one, as a pre-med, you need good grades, right? If you get good grades, that's going to make your life easier later on when you're applying to medical school. If you have bad grades, then it's going to make your life more difficult because then you're usually trying to aim for an even higher MCAT score to compensate for a lower GPA, right? So if you have a high GPA, it's a little bit easier to get away with a decent MCAT score, right? Compare that with a student who has a low GPA and is trying to make up for that with a very high MCAT score, right? The second thing is just think about the kinds of students that are getting good MCAT scores, right? The students who are getting good MCAT scores are not the students with bad grades, right? And the reason why is because if you focus on your college courses, if you get good grades, that means you learned the material well. If you learn the material in these prerequisite courses for the MCAT, then later when you're studying for the MCAT, you simply have to review the information that you previously learned. Compare that with a student who got bad grades, right? If your grades were poor, if you got B's and C's in some of these classes, then it means you probably didn't learn the material very well. So when it comes to preparing for the MCAT, it's not just reviewing the information you previously learned because you didn't properly learn a lot of this science content, right? So your MCAT preparation is not simply a review, it is correctly learning the material for the first time, and then you have to review the material, right? So that's the reason why early on, you really need to focus on doing well in all of these classes. Now, in terms of how to do well, you ultimately need to figure out a good study approach, right? There's a lot of students where they start their MCAT preparation and they ask me questions about how to study. And there's many questions that I'll answer for them, right? How should you review science content? How should you complete practice questions? How should you review practice questions? But sometimes students ask me very very specific questions like, hey, I picked up a set of MCAT books. How should I read these books? Right? When students ask me that question, I usually tell them, hey, by the time you're studying for the MCAT, you should have already figured out how to study for your college classes, right? Your college classes have textbook readings. There are chapters they assign you to read. If you've gotten good grades in your college courses, you've already figured out the best approach for yourself for how to read textbooks, right? And for some students, maybe they highlight, they take notes in their books. For other students, maybe it's they take notes, whether it's handwritten notes or digital notes while they're reading the chapters. You want to figure out a method that works well for you. So that way, when you're studying for the MCAT, it's just using that same study approach that you've already figured out for getting good grades in your college classes, right? Now, in addition to, basic things like how do I read a textbook, you also want to figure out how do you like to study? Are you someone who likes to make study guides? Do you like to make flashcards and review flashcards, right? You want to figure out what works well for yourself because different students operate differently, right? For some students, they read the material, it makes sense to them. For other students, they really need to create a study guide so they can see everything in one page, right? And for some students, their memory is pretty good and they see the material once and they retain it pretty well. For other students, they review the material once and an hour later they forget it, All right. So for students who find that they forget information very quickly, then often they need repetition through flashcards. And there's also other things to keep in mind, which is just how do you study, right? Like what environment do you study better in, right? Some people, they like going to the library, right? They see a lot of other people studying and that makes them want to study. Some people like to study at a cafe, right? And again, all of this is personal preference because some students don't like to study in the library because the chairs are uncomfortable. Some people don't like to study at a cafe because the ambient noise is distracting, right? So figure out for yourself through your college courses all of these different aspects of studying, find out something that works well for you. So by the time you get to the MCAT, you already know your study approach. All right. So now let's talk about more specific strategies for each of the four sections of the exam, right? So I'll talk a little bit more about this in my fourth and final presentation about the MCAT exam, but I'm going to say right now that there are four sections: the Chem Phys, the Cars, the Biochem, and the Psych Soc sections. And each section presents different challenges for students. So it's not like, oh, if I'm good at one section of the MCAT, I'm going to be good at all the other sections of the MCAT. For many students, they often do well in certain sections and struggle in other sections. When it comes to the Chem Phys section, one of the reasons why a lot of students struggle with this section is because it integrates a broad range of subjects, right? So you can see on the slide, the Chem Phys section, 30% of the questions are general chemistry, 25% are biochemistry, 25% are physics, 15% are organic chemistry, and 5% biology. If you think about it, you've honestly never taken an exam that tests all of these different concepts in one sitting, right? You go to university, you take general chemistry, your final exam is just general chemistry, right? And next semester, you take organic chemistry, your final exam's just going to be on organic chemistry. And in fact, you often don't need much general chemistry knowledge in order to do well in organic chemistry, right? The subjects are often treated as completely separate at the university level. But again, that's where the MCAT is different. The MCAT is going to challenge you to integrate all of these different subjects. So you might have one question set of 6 questions. 2 are on biochemistry, 2 are on general chemistry, 1 is on physics, and 1 is on biology, right? Are you able to think about these different subjects in one sitting, all right? And this is something that a lot of students don't think about, right? They don't think about how general chemistry is applied to organic chemistry. They don't think about how organic chemistry can be applied to general chemistry and for all of the different combinations. For example, in organic chemistry, you learn about structure and stability. You learn about how the structure of an organic molecule will determine the stability or reactivity of the compound. In general chemistry, you learn about acids and bases. Well, what's a way that the MCAT might test you on these two topics in combination? Well, can you look at different organic molecules and determine which one is the most acidic based on its chemical structure, right? So integration of these different subjects is something that can be challenging with the Chem Phys section. Now, a second reason why the Chem Phys section can be difficult is what I call the luck factor, right? Now, it never really sounds good to say that there's luck when it comes to taking exams, so let me explain this a little bit more. The Chem Phys section has 59 questions, and you have 95 minutes, right? So it's about an hour and a half, 59 questions. It's a pretty lengthy section. You can see here, 25% of the questions are physics. That means of the 59 questions, you can expect 14 to 15 physics questions in your exam. 14 to 15 physics questions, that's not a lot, right? Keeping in mind that the MCAT tests both Physics 1 and Physics 2. Let's think about all of the different subjects that are tested in Physics 1 and Physics 2. You've got kinematics, forces, work and energy, fluids, electrostatics, circuits, optics, waves. uh, magnetism, right? There's so many topics that are tested on the MCAT, but you only have 14 to 15 questions on any administration of the MCAT on physics. What that means is you might take an MCAT and not see a single question on circuits. You might take another administration of the MCAT and see 3 questions on circuits. That's what I mean by the luck factor, right? Now, if you're someone who is well prepared for the MCAT, it doesn't make a difference to you because you are prepared for every single physics topic that's tested on the exam. However, that's often not the case for a lot of students. There's a lot of students who's stronger in certain topics and weaker in certain topics. So what that means is sometimes they take the MCAT, they see a lot of physics topics that they feel comfortable with, and they get a good score in the Chem Phys section. But on another practice exam, they see a lot of physics questions on topics they're less comfortable with, and they don't score so well in the Chem Phys section, right? That's the luck factor, right? Do you happen to see the topics that you're comfortable with, or do you see the topics you're not comfortable with? And the solution, of course, is not that complicated, right? Which is the solution is you want to make sure you're not just prepared for certain topics, you want to make sure you're prepared for every single topic that's tested on the exam. All right, third reason why the Chem Phys section is difficult is that it requires a complex set of reasoning skills. So the MCAT is not just testing memorization, right? Do you have this concept memorized? Do you have this fact memorized, right? The MCAT is a test of application where 4 skills are emphasized. You can see them over here. The first one, knowledge of scientific concepts and principles. That is more memorization, right? Do you have the science concepts memorized? But then you look at the second one, scientific reasoning and problem solving. That's not just memorization. Same with the next one, reasoning about the design and execution of research. Remember, I mentioned in the last presentation how getting research experience will help you on the MCAT exam. And that's because you can see one of the 4 skills tested on the exam is focused on research design, right? So that means you need familiarity with a lot of research techniques that are performed in research labs, right? So some of them you might have heard about before: polymerase chain reaction, PCR, gel electrophoresis, Western blot, Northern blot, Southern blot, ELISAs, molecular cloning, right? All of those are lab techniques that are tested on an exam. And if you take a lab course, you might learn some of these lab techniques. But the thing is, when you take a lab at your university with one of the lectures, right? Biology lecture with biology lab, you learn the lab techniques from an academic perspective, right? Which is, how does this technique works? And that's not how the MCAT is going to be testing you on these lab techniques. It's not just going to be, hey, do you understand how the technique works? You need to understand from a research perspective, why would a scientist use a Southern blot? What research questions can be answered by using molecular cloning, right? And you're not going to learn this in the classroom, but you can learn this from working in a research lab. All right. Fourth technique, data-based and statistical reasoning. So they're going to present data. You have to be able to analyze the results, determine the conclusions. And that also leads to this last point, really on the quantitative side of math. The Chem Phys section is really only the only section of the MCAT where you have to do calculations. And there's no calculator on the MCAT. You are expected to be able to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, divisions, exponents, logarithms, fractions, right? All of this you're expected to be able to do by hand on the MCAT. And I know for a lot of students, by the time they get to the MCAT, they've forgotten how to do most of this math, right? So that's another reason why this is challenging for students. Some students have just not been great with math and relied on calculators, right? But unfortunately, you can't do that on the MCAT. The other aspect too is there's a lot of equations and constants you're expected to have memorized in order to do the calculations, right? So of course, if you don't have the equations memorized, there's no math for you to do, right? But even then, for a lot of students, they have the equations and the constants memorized, but they still struggle to do the actual math. All right. So those are some of the reasons why the Chem Phys section is challenging for a lot of students. Let's talk about how you, as a community college or first or second year undergraduate student, can start preparing for the exam, right? The first thing is keep a running list of physics and chemistry equations in your notebook, right? When you start studying for the MCAT, the equations that are tested, they're the same equations that you learn in your college courses, right? So for a lot of students, if this is an equation that you memorize in your college courses, that's going to make it easier later on for the MCAT because you've memorized it before. You probably have better recall of that equation, right? And to me, this is quite important because there's a lot of students where for their college courses, especially physics, they get a cheat sheet, right? They get a note card where they can write down all the equations they want. You don't get that for the MCAT, right? For the MCAT, you just have to have those equations and constants memorized, right? So one thing that would be kind of nice actually is if you start memorizing them in your undergraduate courses, so that way by the time you get to the MCAT, it's going to be much easier for you to memorize the equations because you've reviewed them so much before. And this applies not just to equations, this also applies to other things that you need to have memorized, right? So very good examples in biochemistry where you have to memorize the biochemical pathways, right? Memorizing the 10 steps of glycolysis, memorizing each of the steps in the Krebs cycle, and memorizing the key steps in all the side pathways, the pentose phosphate pathway, glycogenolysis, glycogenesis, fatty acid oxidation, ketogenesis, fatty acid synthesis, right? The sooner you begin focusing on memorization in your college courses, the easier it will be to memorize them later on. And for many students, this is actually just something you do in your college classes, right? And many biochemistry classes, the professors will test you on your memorization of the 20 amino acids, right? Now, if you're in a class where the professor is nice and doesn't require you to have the amino acids memorized, then you do have to realize you're kind of at a disadvantage here because other students have memorized it before, but you haven't. In that case, maybe just decide, hey, I'm just going to memorize these amino acids because I have time. It's my first and second year of college or community college. And the last thing I already mentioned earlier, which is the lab techniques you're going to see in your college courses in chemistry lab, biology lab, and such, realize that you're going to learn them from an academic perspective, right? How does a professor view these techniques, right? How a student should use them, but that's different from how a researcher would use these techniques in a lab. So as I said, if you can get research experience in a lab, that will help you a lot. All right, so that was a lot with the Chem Phys section. So now let's talk about the cars section. The CAR section stands for the Critical Analysis and Reasoning Skills section. There's a lot of people who think of the CAR section as being similar to the verbal reasoning section of the SAT or the reading section of the ACT. And the similarity there is that there's no content knowledge required, right? You don't need to know anything about history. You don't need to know anything about literature, about music, or economics, right? For the car section, you're going to be reading passages on different topics in the humanities and social studies, right? And then you have to answer questions about them. And in some ways, that's nice because they're like, oh, great, there's nothing I have to study. But the thing is, that also ends up being a trap for a lot of students because they think, oh, there's nothing I have to study for cars. I don't need to prepare for the cars section. But that's not true. The cars section is a section that a lot of students struggle with. And it is a section that you need to prepare for. And part of the reason why is because critical analysis and reasoning skills can be difficult to obtain. At some point, you're going to have some classmates that just naturally have very strong critical analysis and reasoning skills. these students take a practice exam, right, a diagnostic exam at the beginning of their studies, and they get a perfect score in the cars section without doing any studying. Well, that's because these students have learned these critical analysis and reasoning skills already. Now, how did they learn them? Well, often it's because these students are strong readers, or maybe your classmate is a pre-med who's majoring in rhetoric or philosophy or comparative literature, right? Remember, you don't have to major in the sciences to be a pre-med. You can be any major as a pre-med. And the thing is, if you major in one of those majors I just talked about, right? If you're a philosophy major, you're reading a ton, right? And you're constantly thinking about the text. You're trying to analyze and assess the arguments that are being made. And those are the exact skills that you need to do well in the cars section. So how's that different for most pre-med students that are science majors? Well, when you're a science major, when you're reading textbooks, you're reading for facts. You're not trying to think, oh, is this fact something I can challenge, right? So these skills can be tough for a lot of pre-med students to obtain if they're really focused on the sciences. And a third reason why the car section is difficult is that it covers a variety of disciplines, right? You can see right here are all of the different topics that you can see, right? So for the humanities, you could see passages on architecture, on art, on dance, on ethics, literature, music. Social studies, you've got the whole list there, right? Anthropology, archaeology, education, economics, geography, and such, right? And the reason why I bring this up is because for a lot of students, when they're taking a practice exam, right, the car section has 9 passages, right? They'll find that, okay, there's some passages they do well, and there's some passages that they really struggle in. And the explanation they give for, why they struggle in certain passages and not others is the topic of the passage, right? They say like, oh, this passage was on philosophy. I thought it was really boring. I didn't understand what I was reading, and I missed a whole bunch of questions on that passage. I hear that all the time for students, right? And yes, it can be tough. Sometimes you're reading a passage and it's on art, and the paragraphs of text are saying like, oh, the the facial features of the person in the painting shows how the artist is coming to terms with his or her imminent death, right? And the swing that you can see in the corner is the artist remembering his youth, right? Like you can just imagine, right? Like if you go to a museum and you see this art and you see these like, descriptions of what the painting's supposed to represent. I know there's a lot of people with science backgrounds that just think, like, what is this? Like, what the heck am I reading, right? And that's the challenge for a lot of students. If they don't find something interesting, they don't understand it, and then they can't answer questions about that passage. And the last reason why the card section is tough is because of the time pressure, right? You have 90 minutes for the card section to read 9 passages and answer 53 questions. That's 10 minutes per passage, which doesn't sound so bad. But once you start doing cards practice, you realize 10 minutes per passage is actually quite a time crunch. And for a lot of students who are slow readers, they struggle to even finish the card section. There's a lot of students who can't even complete all 9 passages. Sometimes they can only complete 6 or 7 passages because they read so slowly, right? So again, throwing out a lot of reason why the card section is tough, and can of course also talk about how can you prepare for the card section, right? Now, the tip I have here is really for students who are preparing for the MCAT, which the important thing is to make sure you do a lot of practice, right? Even though there's no topics, there's no concepts for you to study, that doesn't mean you can't prepare for the card section, right? You need to make sure you do regular practice. You get used to reading those passages. You get used to answering the questions, and you learn how does the AMC want you to read and interpret passages of text in order to get to the correct answer, right? Now, of course, if you're a community college student or first or second year undergraduate student, you're not doing course passages or practice questions yet. It's too early for your studies. So what can you do? My recommendation is be a strong reader, right? Don't just be someone where in your spare time, all you do is scroll on social media, right? And I know it's very much like doom scrolling. You open up Instagram, you're just scrolling nonstop for 2 hours, and there goes 2 hours of your time, right? You need to be someone who reads a lot, right? That's how you can be one of those students who takes a diagnostic test and starts off with a strong CAR score, right? If you're just someone who doesn't like to read and the only reading you do is for your textbooks, of course you're going to struggle with CARs later on. But in a sense, it was by your choice not to read, right? Now, a good question, of course, is what should you read? Well, uh, there's all sorts of things you can read. And of course, you're not trying to read things like comic books, right? You're not trying to read jokes, right? Like those things aren't going to help you very much, right? I would say the first thing to start with is just read news articles, right? Reading news articles is already a decent start, right? And part of the reason why is that it helps to build your vocabulary. There's a lot of students who don't understand cars passages because they see too many vocabulary words they don't understand. And of course, if you don't understand, let's say 5% of the words in a passage, you're not going to understand that passage very well. So as you're reading news articles, right, and just from any of the top sources out there, people will naturally throw out vocabulary words here and there, right? Every time you see a vocabulary word, you look up its definition, you learn the definition of that word, and you keep building your vocabulary. Another thing you can consider, of course, is hey, I gave you this list of topics, all right? Pick up some books. Pick up a book about art. Pick up a book about history. Pick up a book about philosophy, right? If you start reading books on these topics, you also build your ability to read and understand these texts. So by the time you're getting to these course passages for MCAT prep, again, your baseline car skills are stronger than where they are now. All right, that's cars. Oh, I do have one more section, one more slide. Um, this is a good question. Who is the author? When it comes to reading, there's a lot of students who will read a passage and they'll be like, oh yeah, this passage is about, Picasso, the artist. So they're like, oh yeah, I'm reading about Picasso. But the thing is, um, the thing that you need to think about is the author, the person who is writing this text. You need to understand, why is the author writing this passage? What is the argument that they're trying to make, right? And part of this is trying to understand, who is the audience? Who is the author writing this passage for? What is the intent of the author? And what is he or she trying to convince the readers of? These are important things to do because many students don't think about this, and you have a lot of MCAT questions testing this, right? They'll ask you things like, why did the author write this passage, right? Or this passage would be most appropriate for which group of people, right? So they're asking about the author, they're asking about the audience. These are many things that students don't think about when they're reading a passage of text. And an important tip here, you can see it's the second bullet point, is how do you know what the author is saying? Well, you need to pick up on word choices that the author makes, right? Undoubtedly, surely, especially, right? Those are a few examples. I'll give you one that a lot of students who are weak in cars often struggles with. It's the phrase may seem, right? So you might have a sentence that says, to critically evaluate a piece of literature by excluding the author may seem bloodless and hollow. I'll repeat that sentence again. To critically assess a work of literature by excluding the author may seem bloodless and hollow. For a lot of students, they read that sentence and their takeaway is, oh, the author of the passage doesn't think that you should analyze a text by excluding the author of that text because they use the words bloodless and hollow that have a negative connotation. These students are reading the passage incorrectly, right? Because they're not recognizing the words may seem, right? I'll give you an example, right? An example is Ken may seem lazy. Think about that phrase. If someone says Ken may seem lazy, do you think they're trying to say that I'm lazy? No, because think about that phrase may seem. If the author is trying to say that I'm lazy, they wouldn't say that I may seem lazy. They would just say Ken is lazy. All right. So that's something important for you to pick up on, that word choice is incredibly important. It's not just, oh, positive connotation, negative connotation. You have to pay close attention to the word choice to understand the point that the author is trying to make. All right. So now let's get to Bob outcome section. Reasons why this section is difficult. The first one is similar to the Chem Phys section, which is that it covers a broad range of topics, right? Not quite as many as Chem Phys, but there's still 4 subjects here: biology, biochemistry, general chemistry, organic chemistry. The second reason is similar to the Chem Phys section is that it tests the same scientific reasoning skills, right? Knowledge of scientific concepts, scientific reasoning and problem solving, reasoning about the design and execution of research, and data-based and statistical reasoning. There's an additional reason, though, that I think distinguishes the Bob Chem from the Chem Phys section is that there's really a lot of focus on complex research passages, right? And the reason why there's this distinction is that when you're looking at the Chem Phys section, like, yes, it will test on chemistry topics and physics topics, and there are research passages in this section, but they're not quite as dense as the research passages that you see in the Chem section, right? Many of the passages in the Chem section are adapted from peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. And for many students, when they read these passages, they have no idea what's going on. They read and it's like all this gibberish, right? I'll give you an example, right? As a scientist is investigating the AGRP gene on hunger and satiety, they identify AGRP plus/minus mice, and they use siRNAs to target the AGRP gene, and they measure leptin and ghrelin levels in the mice, right? That, for a lot of students, is gibberish. What the heck is AGRP? What the heck is siRNA? What is leptin? What is ghrelin? There's all these things that are just very advanced and hard for students to understand, right? And the reason why is just because most students don't have experience reading scientific journal articles. Like I said, you might learn about lab techniques tested in the MCAT when you take biology lab, chemistry lab, and such, but that's just not how those lab techniques are used in research. So for students who join a research lab, they're usually going to be paired with a graduate student or a postdoc, and that grad student or postdoc will usually, give them a few papers to read. They're like, hey, this is what the project you're going to be working on is about. Read a few papers here to get some background, right? And we can talk about these papers to make sure you understand the study we're trying to do. If you don't have that research experience, how are you going to learn this? Well, one thing you can do is try reading some journal articles in your spare time, right? And if you're at a university, you really have access to all of the journal articles in the world for free, which is kind of nice. But if for some reason you don't have access to journal articles, there's a lot of free journals out there, right? So a very common one is eLife, right? So that's the letter E, life. You can all look up online, eLife, and you're going to see it's a scientific journal. Once you go to eLife, pick a topic, neuroscience, immunology, genetics, right? Pick an article, start reading it. Can you understand the passage? Can you understand the techniques they're describing? And when they show the figures of the results, are you able to understand the results, right? And one thing that's kind of nice is when you read these journal articles, they tell you everything you need to know, right? Because they show you the results, and then the journal articles will also include their interpretation of the results, right? So in that sense, it's not really challenging because you've got the solution in the article. But why is this helpful in the MCAT? Well, because of MCAT, they'll give you the results, but you have to interpret the results to answer the questions correctly, right? So the more journal articles you read, the more practice you have with being able to assess and analyze these journal articles to better perform on these questions on the exam. All right, finally, we have the psych-soc section. I will say, for a lot of students, the psych-soc section comes off as being the easiest section of the exam. And that's because, it's the challenging aspect of the section in some ways isn't that challenging, right? Because it's just a lot of vocabulary, right? If you can memorize a lot of vocabulary words, you can often do pretty well in the section. But other reasons why this section is challenging is because it's the newest section of the exam. So, before the MCAT only had 3 sections, right? The psych-soc section is a new addition to the exam. And when it's the newest section of the exam, it means that test prep experts like myself know less about the section than the other sections. But of course, if test prep experts know less about the section, then students taking the exam know even less, right? This is starting to become less and less of an issue, though, because every year the AAMC releases new MCAT practice questions that allows us to learn more about the psych-soc section. And I would say at this point, we have a pretty decent understanding of the psych-soc section, though not as good as the other 3 sections of the exam. The research focus, that's the same thing we talked about. Research is a big deal in the MCAT. And the last thing, exam fatigue is worth thinking about. The MCAT is 7 hours. It's a 7-hour exam. I'm pretty sure most of you have never taken a 7-hour exam, right? The longest exam you usually have in college is a 3-hour exam. So when you have a 7-hour exam, it can be quite daunting, and that's because for a lot of students, it's very difficult for them to maintain focus over 7 hours. In the psych-soc section, being the last section of the exam, is the one where a lot of students have the tendency of, getting lazy, right? They're like, oh, I'm sick of this exam. I just want to be done with this exam, right? And they're not focusing as much. They're just clicking answers. They just want to be done with the exam, but that's not good because if you're not focusing, you're not performing at your best. So the solution is not that complicated. It simply means you need to take a lot of practice exams to build up stamina, right? Just like running a marathon. If you try running a marathon right now, you're not going to make it to 26 miles. But if you practice running a lot, then eventually you can run the full marathon. The same thing for the MCAT, right? If you only do 30 minutes of practice a day, that's not going to be enough. You need to take full-length MCAT practice exams, take multiple 7-hour exams until on test day, you can maintain focus over the entire 7 hours. All right, so what are some things you can do? Well, as I said, the psych-soc section is often the easiest section. Focusing on memorization is helpful, but what I'll often see is students will create flashcards. On one side of the flashcard, they'll have the term. On the other side of the flashcard, they'll have the definition. And that seems okay, but it actually isn't. And the reason is that how many questions in the psych-soc section will simply ask you, what is the definition of X? What is the definition of Y? And the answer is almost none, right? So if you're focusing on memorizing definitions, it's not going to get you very far, right? So if the psych-soc section is not testing definitions, what is it testing? Well, the standard psych-soc question has the form of, this phenomena described in paragraph 3 of the passage is an example of whose theory of what. This goes to show that the psych-soc section isn't focused on memorizing definitions. Instead, it's focused on examples. So what does that mean? It means that when you're learning any term for the psych-social section, yes, you want to know the definition, but just as important is making sure that you have examples for every term. I'll give a simple example. There's a lot of students who, have learned about operant conditioning, right, with reinforcement and punishment, right? These are the examples where, you take an exam, you get a good grade, and you get a cookie, right? So yes, that's positive reinforcement, right? I do well on my exam, I get a cookie. There's an aspect of operant conditioning that's focused on reinforcement schedules. The aspect on reinforcement schedules is really asking the question of how often is reinforcement provided? And there's 4 reinforcement schedules: fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. There's a lot of students who, ask them, all right, let's talk about the reinforcement schedules. They'll give me the definitions of each, but they can't give me any examples, right? They'll be like, oh, fixed ratio, that's when you get reinforcement after completing a fixed number of behavioral responses. Great, you've got the definition, but why can't you give me an example? Right? And the example isn't necessarily that complicated. The example would just be, I've got a rat in a cage. And there's a lever in the cage as well. Every time the rat presses the lever 5 times, it gets a piece of peanut butter, right? So when that rat presses the lever for the 5th time, the 10th time, the 15th time, and the 20th time, it gets a piece of peanut butter. That's it, right? But you'll be surprised how many students who don't include examples with their definitions, and that leads them to miss a lot of psych-soc questions. All right. So I've been talking a lot, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of, right now, while you're in community college and as a first or second year undergrad, what are some of the things you can be doing to prepare for the exam? And now is the point of the presentation where I'm going to go ahead and take your questions. If you have questions, feel free to submit them in the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll start going through them. All right, first question. Do you recommend any MCAT prep courses? So getting help with MCAT is not a bad thing, right? Like, of course, I might sound a little biased because I work for a test prep company that helps students with the MCAT, right? So the way I think about it is, let's say you have one student who studies for the MCAT by themselves versus another student who works with an MCAT expert. Who's going to do better on the MCAT? Well, probably the student who works with an MCAT expert, right? So in that regard, there's nothing that you lose from taking an MCAT course, right? An MCAT course can only help you; it's not going to hurt you, all right? So I think for a lot of students, reasons why they might not take an MCAT course or sign up for MCAT tutoring and such, it's often concerns with the cost, right? Because test prep is not cheap. Right? If you want to sign up for an MCAT class, if you want to work with an MCAT tutor, it is an expense to consider, right? So for some people, they do have to think a little bit about, do they have the finances to be able to afford prep and such? But if finances are not a concern, then of course, working with an MCAT expert is better than working alone.
Can I just
All
add
right. Are there
one?
other?
Can I just add one thing? So I think the idea of not, w- you know, and I know the cost is a big thing, but it's an investment. It's an investment for the next 40 years of your life and career. And if you don't get a good test score the first time, you're gonna have to take it the second time. So it's costing you time and maybe delaying your application 1 year and on the end of it losing out on 1 year of salary as a physician. So like take that into consideration. that it's an investment that you're making in yourself. And, maybe, working for 6 months and, paying for the course or cutting back on going, Starbucks every day, that's $5 right there, $50 a week, $200 a month, so you're just gonna have to make sacrifices just like anything in life. So just want to throw that out there, my 2 cents on that.
Absolutely. Next question, are there other things we can start to read besides articles? Well, I gave suggestions earlier, right? For the sciences, you can certainly begin reading scientific journal articles, but eLife, as well as other open press, open access journals. And I also gave suggestions for cars, right? Which is for cars, start reading news articles, right? Start going to the library, go get some books on humanities and social studies topics. Those are both good options to start reading while you're early on as a pre-med. All right. If you're planning on taking a gap year after undergrad, when do you take the MCAT? You have a lot of flexibility, right? If you're planning on taking a gap year, it doesn't necessarily have that much impact on when to take the MCAT, right? Keep in mind that your MCAT score is valid for 3 years, right? So whenever you choose to take the MCAT, you'll need to apply to medical school within 3 years. So if you're going to take a gap year, you could take the MCAT, up to 3 years before you apply to medical school. Right now, if you're taking a single gap year, that means you're applying to medical school the summer after you graduate, right? So you apply to medical school the summer after you graduate. So in your gap year, you're interviewing at medical schools, right? So in that case, you're probably taking the MCAT in your junior or senior year, right? The latest you can take the MCAT is going to be the spring of your senior year with the timeline you've described. But I would say your junior year and senior year would both be fine. So things you want to consider are, when will you have completed all of the prerequisite courses for the exam, as well as when are you going to have a good chunk of time to be able to dedicate towards your MCAT prep. All right, next question. If you're applying for extra time accommodations and awaiting a decision, should you take your diagnostic and other exams with 7.5 hours of wait to see how much time you've added? So you have to look a little bit at your timeline, right? The first thing is the AMC is notoriously slow when it comes to approving accommodations applications, right? It takes months and often it can take up to half a year, right? I've worked with students where, the AMC, they have some deadline on their website saying, oh, we're going to get back to you within X number of days. And then you log in and they say, oh, we actually can't get a response to you until 2 months after that deadline, right? So that's a very frustrating aspect of applying for accommodations, that you need to apply incredibly early. Otherwise, you're going to be in this awkward situation, right? So let's say, for example, right now it's February. You want to take the MCAT in May. If you just applied for accommodations, you might not hear back until May or after you've taken your exam, right? So that's a very awkward situation where you essentially just have to prep as if you have no accommodations in case your accommodations application is denied, right? Now, a more ideal situation would be, hey, it's February, you want to take the exam in September. You're focusing your classes now. You want to start picking up with your MCAT prep over the summer. Right now, you're just doing content review. That's fine. You apply for accommodations now, right? For the rest of the spring, you're doing content review, so you're not really focusing on practice. You hear back in May or June, that's when you're going to start practice. And now you can practice with the amount of time based on your accommodations application, right? So essentially just you have to submit your accommodations application as soon as possible so you don't have that awkward situation of, do I keep doing practice without accommodations or with accommodations? But if you're in that earlier situation I was talking about, you want to take the MCAT in May, you've submitted your application, but you haven't heard back yet, you don't have a choice except to prep without extra time. Next question, would creating a routine for the day of the exam be helpful? Well, it depends a little bit on what you talked about, a routine for the day of the exam, right? Because in a sense, your day is largely already built out, right? You go to the exam, You register, you show them your ID, they check you in, you go through the examining agreement and tutorial, right? That's 10-15 minutes. You have the chem phys section, that's 95 minutes. You get a 10-minute break. You have the cars section, which is 90 minutes. You get a 30-minute lunch break. And then you have the Bao Chem section, that's another 95 minutes. You get a 10-minute break, and then you have the Psych Soc section, which is 95 minutes, right? So your routine's pretty much already built out for you, right? If there's anything that you can do, to prepare for that, it would be number one, figuring out what day you're going to wake up, right? Oh, sorry, what time you're going to wake up. So if your exam's at 8 a.m., you have to drive 20 minutes to your testing center. You want to have breakfast beforehand. Think about what time you're going to wake up. Think about what you're going to have for breakfast. You also need to think about what lunch are you going to bring to the testing center and leave in your locker, right? All of these things you do want to plan out as part of your routine, but for the actual exam itself, you don't have any flexibility. It's not like you choose how long your breaks are or when you're going to take the exam, right? The MCAT starts at 8 a.m. for all students. All
Some
right,
routine there.
next.
Can I add
Go
one
ahead,
thing,
Juven.
Dr. Tao? So if you're somebody who's not a morning person, don't schedule for the MCAT at 8 o'clock in the morning. Also, if you are someone who doesn't drink coffee, but you decide in the morning of the MCAT to drink coffee, you're going to be jittery, or vice versa. If you're a coffee drinker, so basically with like food and diet, or like, if you're one of those people that rolls out of bed and goes to class and doesn't, eat breakfast, but on the day of the MCAT, you end up eating like 3 eggs and a bunch of other stuff, and then you have like GI issues. So don't, like, practice in that sense, things that you can control, what you eat, what you're used to, what you wake up, sleep, all those things. So I think in that routine is as well, but in terms of like other routine, it's just, I don't think there is, but like those types, because I know, like, Matt Perennial, right? Matt, one of our friends, Matt, he basically the first time he took the MCAT, he had a big breakfast and he had some GI issues during the exam. So don't do that.
Also, just a quick note about that. There was a time period where the MCAT gave you different time options for registering for the exam, but that was only during COVID, right? So right now for the MCAT, 8 a.m. is the only option. So unfortunately, you are stuck with 8 a.m. All right, next question. Is there free response questions on the MCAT? No, the MCAT is a complete multiple choice. How can I improve my math skills, such as logs and divisions? You need to do practice questions. How much is the MCAT? I think the MCAT's about $330 to register for, and it increases a little bit each year, but it's on the order of hundreds of dollars. How much time I should wait to take the MCAT again? You should not be planning for failure, right? Like, your goal is not to take the MCAT multiple times. Your goal is to take the MCAT once and be done, right? This is not the SAT or ACT where you get to choose which scores you're going to send to medical schools. Sorry, to colleges and universities, right? Medical schools are going to see every single one of your MCAT scores, and the thing is, if you have multiple scores in your application, that actually makes your application look worse, right? So it's actually important for you to take the MCAT as few times as possible. Don't plan on retaking the MCAT, right? If you take the MCAT when you're not ready, that's just bad planning, right? You should only take the MCAT when you're ready. So that is not a question you should be asking of, how much time should I wait to take the MCAT? It should be, I'm going to take the MCAT once and I'm going to be done. Now, of course, some students have to retake. That's fine, but that's not the question you begin asking, right? Like, if you need to retake the MCAT, you need to do a very thorough analysis of why did I not get the score I want, right? Was there a fluke on test day, or was I just not prepared, right? I speak to a lot of students, right? And they're like, oh yeah, I took the MCAT, I didn't get the score that I wanted. Okay, so if I didn't get the score that I wanted, I asked them, how are you scoring your practice exams? And they're like, oh yeah, I wasn't scoring very well on my practice exams either. And I'm like, well, what did you expect, right? Get bad scores on your practice exams, get a bad score on test day, right? So, like I said, don't take the exam if you're not ready, right? And if for some reason you took the MCAT when you're not ready, then when do you retake the exam? You retake the exam when you are ready. All right. Next question. What should a pre-med student that hasn't that where English is not the first language do to get better at reading or understanding? So this is the thing that's tricky, right? Because yes, there's a lot of students where English is not their first language, and many of these students are very strong in the sciences, and they can get very high scores in the three science sections, but they have a really low score in cars. It's hard, it's a little hard to make that English argument because it's not like the chem phys section is in another language, right? The chem phys section, the biochem section, the psych social sections are all in English. So if you can get good scores in the science sections, then clearly it's not like you can't understand English, right? So instead, what you're lacking is really like critical analysis and reasoning skills, right? And it's not like those skills only exist in English, right? Like those skills exist in every single language. So, you do have to think about, can you process the arguments that are stated in the text? And some things you might have to work on, right? Like I'm not saying that, if English is not your first language, that, you're just the same as every other pre-med. You probably have to work harder than other students, but I'm telling you that it can be done, right? So don't try to use English as not your first language as an excuse for why you can't do well in cars.
The other thing that I would just say that for someone whose English is not their first language, you have to start like, it's kind of like saying, want to run an Olympic race. You don't show up the first day to the marathon, Olympic marathon, to run that. So you start baby steps. So if you're brand new to America, you start reading children's books, and then you kind of work your way up. Now, if you're in college or university, sometimes they, like a community college, also they put you in ESL classes, which is a great place to start, but just don't accept that. Like learn, and then there's also like really great ESL teachers at community colleges that could give you books and advise you on like what you should start reading. And then also AI has also been really good. Like you want to read a passage that's kind of complex and you're like, I don't know. You could upload it, you could read it, and you could read the article and then maybe write like, I don't know, 3 4 paragraphs about what the content of that paragraph was, and you could like submit it to AI, and then they could give you, and if it matches and it's close, then you understood it. But I think like working with ESL instructors, they're probably the best people at doing that, because they're experts in that, they're subject experts. And so, but it's, English is not my first language, and it's hard. It's a hard thing, but once you get a hang of it, you're fine. And there is a lot of doctors out there that English is not their first language and they're doing fine. So it's doable.
Great. And I have time for one last question today. So this will be the last question. The question is for a student who is non-traditional and they're currently at community college, they're looking to transfer to a UC. So in terms of being an older student, I will say I've worked with multiple students who are older, right? And for various reasons, right? There's some people where, because of family reasons, they've never been able to pursue, their dream of becoming a physician. And right now that they're older and, maybe their kids are all grown up, now they can go back and do what they have always wanted to do. Or there's some people who change careers, very, very last minute and, decide this is what they want to do with their life, right? Um, there are some differences, right? Which is, you have to get used to sitting in a classroom with a lot of people that are much younger than you, right? But and you also have to realize many of these students, their lives are going to be different, right? Most students studying for the MCAT, they're just students, right? as someone who's non-traditional, maybe you have to work full time, maybe you have different life obligations, right? So realize that your path is not necessarily the same. Um, but my advice is, um, you still need to make things work, right? And a lot of this I think still goes back to this mental aspect, because many of these people I speak to, they're just like, oh, I haven't taken a class in so long, like I just can't do this and such, right? So a lot of this is this mental aspect of, yeah, this is something I can do. Like, yes, I'm older, but I can still take these same classes. I can still get A's in these classes, right? And a lot of it is finding time to study. Keep in mind for the MCAT, it's a lot of students will study 300 to 500 hours for the MCAT. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, especially as a non-traditional student, how many hours you have to put into studying for the MCAT. So, you know, it takes a lot of time. There's no shortcuts, right? Medical schools are not going to say, oh, just because, or, the MCAT's not going to be like, oh, just because you're a non-traditional student, we're going to give you an easier version of the exam, right? You get the same version of the exam as everyone else, have the mindset that this is something that you're capable of doing, put in the time and effort, and you can certainly be successful.
Making a plug next week on Saturday, March 1st. We have a somebody who started med school at 50 and she's 54 now. And she's a third year medical student. So Jen, so you should come and check her out next week and ask her all the questions you want. And she's really inspiring. So but you can do it, there's I had a resident who was 60 years old that I worked with, and they were excellent. So um they were excellent physicians. So you could do it, the only person that could stop you is you, but it's going to be challenging. It's not going to be easy, but you can do it. Well, anyways, Dr. Tao has to go, and I'm actually in the middle of a work meeting, so I've been going in and out. So thank you again for joining us, Dr. Tao, again. um Thank you for joining us again, and making time for us, and thanks everyone for coming on a Saturday morning. um and yeah, thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.